and welcome to iMotor's online lessons. My name is Malecia and I'm from Muizenberg.
And my name is Marlin and I come from Capricorn, which is also in Muizenberg.
In today's lesson, we're going all the way to the moon and back to help you achieve 3 things. Number 1, you'll be able to explain how the moon affects the ocean and identify different types of ocean tides.
Number 2, you'll understand how tides rise and fall and what this means for ocean plants and animals.
And number 3, you'll learn how you can forecast tides and use the seashore safely.
That's pretty cool.
To start our journey, let's close our eyes and think about the last time you were at the beach. Listen to the sound of the waves slapping the sand. Feel that same sand crunching between your toes. Is it wet or is it dry? Think about walking along the seashore and noticing where the dark, wet sand becomes dry yellow sand as you walk away from the ocean and towards the land. Sometimes you might even notice a clear line where the wet sand and dry sand meet. On some parts of South Africa's coasts, there will be piles of kelp. Remember the sea bamboo we mentioned in lesson 1? Scattered along this line, if you dig around here to explore, you might find lots of shells, or perhaps the skeleton of a rock lobster, or the feather of a seagull.
That line between dry and wet sand is our first clue in today's lesson. Have you noticed that sometimes the ocean seems very full?
Yes, sometimes the waves are so high that they come rushing all the way up the beach.
And people have to grab their umbrellas and their wet towels and run further up, away from the waves.
My mom used to hate it when that happened when we were kids.
But other times, the beach looks a lot wider and the ocean seems to have moved away.
The ocean changes a lot actually.
It does. There can be big waves and wind on some days, or a calm, flat sea on other days. But there's one thing that we know happens every day, twice a day, and that's the rise and fall of the ocean's water levels. We call these ocean tides.
How does the moon fit into all of this?
We're getting there. The moon is very important in this story because the pull of gravity between the earth and the moon is what causes tides.
Wait a minute, gravity? Like outer space gravity?
Right. Do you know the story of Isaac Newton, the English scientist who was supposed to have discovered gravity after an apple fell on his head and he was sitting under a tree one day?
Yes, ouch.
Well, the bit about the apple falling on his head and sparking that idea isn't true, but the theory he came up with helps explain why we don't fall off the earth while it spins around in the universe. Gravity is an invisible force that pulls objects towards each other. It's like a magnet pulling metal. Gravity is what holds all the different planets in our solar system circling around the sun. We call that an orbit. Gravity also keeps the moon circling or orbiting around the earth. The moon and the earth act almost like magnets and metal as they circle around each other in space. The moon's gravitational force, that invisible force of attraction, makes the sea bulge out of the earth as it pulls it towards itself.
No way, that's so cool.
The sea on the opposite side of the earth, furthest away from the moon, also bulges out. This is called tidal force, where the ocean is bulging out from the earth. That's a high tide. Since the earth is always rotating or turning, 2 tides happen each day here in South Africa. That means that there is a high tide twice a day and a low tide twice a day. The area of coast where you live will pass through those bulges, where the moon is pulling the sea, twice every day. And the area of coast where you live will pass through the area where the sea is not bulging and experience a low tide twice a day.
What about the sun? Does it have anything to do with this?
The sun also has a gravitational force that impacts the tides. But because the moon is much closer to the earth, its force has more of an impact.
Okay, so we have a high tide and low tide every day. Is that it?
Well, not exactly. There are also 2 types of tides, neap tide and spring tide. We get 2 of each type of tide in 1 month. That's because of the moon's monthly orbit around the earth.
Ah, yes, because the earth is rotating, but the moon is also orbiting the earth while it's rotating. It doesn't stay still.
You've got it. Kind of amazing, isn't it?
It really is.
So back to neap tide and spring tides. When the sun, the earth and the moon are in a straight line with each other, the tides are strongest. That means we have a very high tide and a very low tide. We call these spring tides. You'll know it's a spring tide when it's a full moon and a new moon. When the sun and the moon are perpendicular to each other in relation to the earth, that means the sun and the moon make a 90-degree or a right angle with the earth, and they all form the shape of an L. The tides are weakest. We call these neap tides.
Ah, why are tides important though? And how do they fit in with everything else we've been talking about?
Think about some of the things you've learned about our oceans so far. What comes to mind?
We know that we need our oceans for food. Why would tides be important when it comes to food?
Well, some people gather food like mussels, oysters, and seaweed from the shoreline and rocks next to the ocean. Getting food is much easier when the tide is low, not to mention much less dangerous, because they won't get swept off the rocks by waves. Fishermen who go out to sea in boats also need to know about tides, because it helps them figure out when it's safest to launch their boat or bring it into a harbor and land it on a beach. If you're an ocean tour guide, you need to know when it's safest to take tourists out. If you're an oceanographer, you might even study tides, and you definitely need to know about them for your work. We need to know if a tide is high or low, if it's coming in, getting higher, or going out, getting lower, so that we know where and when to dive, how to bring a ship into or out of a harbor. And think about the marine biologists studying the very special plants and animals that live on the rocky shore, where the tides play a huge role.
What about enjoying ourselves at the beach? Why should we know about tides if we want to visit the beach or go for a swim or a surf?
Well, you'd need to know about tides if you want to surf, because it helps you decide where the best spots are for the greatest wave to ride. And if you're playing on the beach, it's best to keep an eye on the tide. You and your friends want to keep safe so that you're not caught too far out on the rocks when the tide starts coming in and a wave could knock you off your feet.
That's a good point. And if you're building sandcastles with your younger kids, you don't want your sandcastles to get washed away by a wave.
That was my worst as a kid.
Okay, let's recap what we've learned today. Gravity is an invisible force that makes the moon pull our oceans like a magnet, causing ocean tides.
Because the earth rotates, we experience 2 high tides and 2 low tides every day. And we experience 2 spring tides and 2 neap tides a month.
Can you remember what a spring tide is and what a neap tide is? That's right, the highest tides and the lowest tides.
And we need to know about tides so that we can gather food and use the ocean safely.
But before we go, we have to tell you that in the next lesson, you'll meet some of our favorite animals in the ocean. They live on the rocks and in the tidal pools that you'll find between the beach, sand and the ocean. Yes, the rocky shore rock stars.
Exactly. The rocky shore is a special ecosystem with some amazing animals.
1 second. Can we remember what an ecosystem is again?
If you made notes from lesson 1, you'll know that an ecosystem is an area that is made up of animals, plants and all the non-living things they need to survive.
Ah, yes. That's a good thing to write down in our notebooks.
Tides are really important for the plants and animals of the rocky shore ecosystem. They have to cope with living on dry rocks and shallow pools at low tide, and then having waves and water crash over them at high tide. How do they do it? We'll find out in our next lesson.
One last thing about tides. Did you know you could learn to predict tides just by understanding their cycle and how they relate to the moon? You can also look it up on the weather forecast websites or download a tide table to check your facts.
Let's all write down 3 reasons why it's important to know the tides in our notebooks. And remember to always check what the tide is doing, coming or going, before you get in the water.
We hope you've enjoyed our I'm Water online lesson on ocean tides, and we hope to see you soon. Please leave a comment and subscribe to our channel for more.
Bye-bye.